see the numbers start to pop up there. Great to see. Lots of people here today. Thank you for joining. So my name is Sarah McCready and I'm one of the core organizers of Douglas Week 2021. Here with my other lovely co-organizers who you can see on your screen right now, Dr. Caroline Schroeder, Kristen Leary, and Dr. Tim Grunland. And we're really delighted to welcome you to this wide-ranging celebration of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass and his visit to Ireland 176 years ago. What started out as a one-day academic symposium has become an extravaganza of music, education, sport, literature, history, and creativity. So thank you for being here today. I'm just going to pass over to my colleague team for a little bit of housekeeping before we begin.
Hi everyone, you're very welcome. We're all really looking forward to today's event. Several of us are academics, so we're very interested not just in, I suppose, learning more about Douglass, but in thinking about how we learn and how we teach Douglass. And this should be a really important panel. I'll just mention a couple of housekeeping details that you should be aware of. First of all, you should be aware that this event and all events throughout Douglass Week will be recorded and available for viewing in the coming days. You will find a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and please submit questions through that channel, and we're going to be keeping an eye on your questions and comments throughout the show, and we'll be submitting them and passing them on to the panelists for discussion and analysis later. Okay, we hope that you enjoy this event, and please feel free to share on social media that you're here with us. Our hashtag is Douglass Week, and yeah, please enjoy. I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Dónal Hassett now.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you see me? Yeah, okay, great. So good afternoon and welcome to this panel on teaching Douglass and decolonizing the curriculum. So I want to begin by thanking the organizers of Douglass Week for all the hard work they put in to curate this incredibly diverse and engaging program. I've been lucky enough to see behind the scenes on what has been going on, and it's just an incredible amount of work has gone into all the amazing events we've had. So it's a real credit to all of the organizers. So throughout his life, Douglass vaunted the value of education, famously declaring, quote, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." However, the education Douglass received was largely in spite of, not because of, the educational institutions in the country where he grew up as an enslaved child. To this day, educational spaces can be hostile environments in which to teach, to work, and to learn for minorities and migrants. The curriculums they teach and the pedagogical methods they use can nominally promote diversity, while in practice really perpetuating forms of exclusion. I've been struck by how often in the course of this week, critical questions have been raised by speakers and audience members about the role played by education in Ireland, the UK, and the US in both countering racism and perpetuating it. So the goal of this panel is to use Douglass's story as a prism through which we can reconsider and reimagine the way we teach our past and understand our present. So unfortunately, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Hussein Omar, has had to withdraw from this event for reasons beyond his control, but we wish him all the best. And I will try to speak during the discussion to the great work Hussein has been doing with colleagues and students in University College Dublin to reimagine the curriculum there. Hussein is the historian of the Middle East and has published widely on politics and colonialism in Egypt. He is currently preparing a really fantastic book that uses the story of one family over the course of 500 years to write a history of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. So I've had really great discussions with Hussein on his activism and practice around the question of decolonizing the curriculum from his days as a student in Oxford up to his appointment in UCD as far as I know, the only tenured person of colour in a history department in a university in the Republic of Ireland. So please do keep an eye out for Hussein's interventions on these questions in the future. And we think of this panel very much as the beginning of a much broader discussion and that will continue to take place at third level and in other parts of the education system over the years to come. I am delighted to say, however, that we do have a really illustrious panel with us today for this discussion. Firstly, we're joined by Dr. Naomi Masheti, Cork Migrant Centre. Naomi holds a doctorate in psychology from UCC and has been at the forefront of designing culturally sensitive training programs for frontline service providers. She was instrumental in setting up the Cork Migrant Centre's psychological wellbeing and integration hub just around the corner from my own house at the Nanonagle place. And she's focused on culturally sensitive services and transformative social justice work. So Naomi has had a hand in all of the fantastic work we've seen from the Cork Migrant Centre during Douglas Week. She also has extensive experience of designing materials to promote understanding of diversity in Ireland. And she has an interest in integrating those ideas into school curriculums here. So that's something that I'm looking forward to hearing her talk about. Then we have Dr. Hannah Rose Murray. Hannah Rose holds a PhD from the University of Nottingham and is currently a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on the recovery of African-American oratorical, literary and visual testimony in Britain during the 19th century. Her first book, Advocates of Freedom, African-American Transatlantic Abolitionism in the British Isles, was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. She has organised numerous community events, including talks, primary and secondary school workshops, heritage plaques, performances, podcasts, plays, exhibitions, and walking tours on both sides of the Atlantic. And her second book, co-authored with John Kaufman McGibbon, focuses on Frederick Douglass in Britain and Ireland. We are also lucky enough to be joined by two of the driving forces behind Douglas Week. Firstly, we have my good friend and colleague, Dr. Caroline Schroeder. Caroline is the lead project coordinator of Douglas Week and has been working behind the scenes to put together this fantastic program for months and months at this stage. I've been blown away by her ability to draw so many different threads together with such patience and grace. So Caroline holds a PhD in American Studies and Film at the University College Cork, and her research examines cinematic representations of slavery, racism and stereotyping as part of her broader interest in systemic racism, historical and in the present day. And she's been involved in lots of different initiatives, including the University Studying Slavery Project, the Free the Slaves Initiative, Students Ending Slavery. And finally, then rounding out our panel, we are joined by Kirsten Leary. Kirsten is one of the advisors, senior advisor to the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and a founder of the Frederick Douglass Ireland Project. She's an attorney based in Washington, DC, and has extensive experience working with the US government and nonprofit groups, trade unions and policy organizations, building diverse coalitions around legislative and policy issues. She began her career on the staff of the late Senator Edward Kennedy and has worked on many national political campaigns. Kirsten is a former vice chair of the board of the Washington Ireland Programme, a graduate of Boston College and the Catholic University School of Law. So the spirit of co-production of knowledge that, in my view, should underpin all discussions about decolonizing the curriculum, I really encourage members of the audience to contribute with comments and questions using the Q&A function throughout our discussion. So this is not just a case of us speaking to you. This should be a collaborative event. So I'd like to begin our discussion with a fairly broad question for the panel. So what do you think decolonizing the curriculum should mean in an Irish context? And I might come to you, Naomi, first, because you have had experience working on these issues in the Cork Migrant Centre. So what do you think decolonizing the curriculum might mean in the Irish context?
Thank you very, very much for inviting me, and I'm really honored to be with such a panel and really to appreciate, like you said, the work that Carlo and her team have put into this, and we've been working with them for the last couple of months. Where do I start? I think even when we started talking about Frederick Douglass with Caroline, and I said looking at it and looking at the part that he came to Ireland, and he was working with O'Connell, who was a big person in the resistance movement, and all the work that the women, particularly in Ireland, took in kind of getting into the anti-slavery abolition movement. I started thinking that I don't know about this. The kids, my kids that have gone to school and done history, they've done the history of resistance, but nothing about that. And being in Ireland, I know there's very little taught about slave trade, for example, or anybody else. And I actually just started thinking more. We were already in the process of trying to diversify the curriculum. And I started thinking, yeah, actually, it is time to look at this. And kind of justified the work that we were already doing because we felt it was really needed. And before that, and even before I say what I mean by decolonization, because it's often used in political terms, but in these times we are really looking at it in terms of the curriculum and how we rethink and reframe and reconstruct. And I mean really reconstruct, because we often talk about diversity almost as though it's a subtopic. It's something that we are adding in a corner or just adding a book into something that is already existing. And I'm like, no, that's not it. This is reconstructing. And I had been involved or following processes of constructing the curriculum in South Africa, where it was very kind of rampant there in the Cape Town University. And in the UK, a lot of debates around that. My curriculum is white. And kind of ways in which the universities in the UK are engaging in looking at the curriculum and kind of really through a decolonization lens. And that reflected back and looked at the Irish accent and said, yes, actually my curriculum is very white here, because I went to UCC for my undergraduate and my master's and my PhD, and I was the only Black person in all those, my undergraduate class, my master's and my PhD class. Not only was I the only white person, the psychology I studied was very white, very theorized from a very Western perspective, very theoretical framework. I remember this funny comment I came across by Guthrie that even the rat was white. And so it was very, very white. And it was only when I started doing my PhD that I then started going into cross-cultural psychology and transcultural psychology, and really coming across all this wild of wealth of these other indigenous psychologies that actually make sense. And I started thinking, these are the universities that are training people to go and work in these developing countries, or to go and work in China or whatever else, or India. And you're only being taught in this very narrow framework. And when you go there, then you're so unprepared as to then what happens, and you're working as a student. And so it actually just kind of brought me back to the idea of just knowledge. And at the center of it is knowledge, really. And looking at knowledge and saying, no matter what philosophical postmodernism or whatever philosophical debates we may have, it's not neutral. Knowledge is not neutral. Knowledge it's embedded within the symmetrical powers, within the powers, symmetrical disparities of power. And it's really, even looking at Irish, for example, if you look at Ireland in the context of they are coming from colonial times, and I would say, so to speak, Ireland is in the process of decolonizing. They are still in the legacy of being colonized by the British and being dispossessed even of their own language, to a point where they're having to get that back and recenter it in their history, tell it in their own ways, because their voices were silenced. And I'm thinking that this should go beyond that, because Ireland itself is also in a position of being colonized and trying to regroup that. But on the other hand, it's also positionality is in the process of the global north. And these were just terms that were created by colonial legacy. So we have the global north and we have the global south. And the power disparity is in the global north. So anybody who has ever been colonized knows that power and knowledge is very important in how it's produced and how it's used and what it's used for. And in this case, then, the knowledge that was privileged was by the colonizers. So Ireland stands in this position where it was colonized, but it's also in the global north, which holds the power, and the power that is privileged, and that is the knowledge that is privileged. And when we talk about curriculum, we are talking about the knowledge that is valued, that is being passed on in the curriculum. So this knowledge that is valued by virtue of Ireland being in the global north then becomes that knowledge that is valued, that is in the north. And what that does then is that it marginalizes other forms of knowing that are in the south. And in a way, it's almost epistemology, colonialism all over again, because it's oppression of these other forms of knowing. So I think, to me now, decolonizing in the Irish context means not just diversity, where we are talking about have all these different books that we can add on to this, or have this corner of this subject, but really, really reflecting on that power that is there, the power disparity that is there, particularly in the concept of the global North and the global South, and looking at our own assumptions. Because I like, my favorite author is Logov. She's talked a lot about sociocultural and psychology. And she says that you are immersed in your own culture. You cannot but. It's like a fish in water. You can't survive outside the water. So our assumptions are so shaped by our own cultures that it's almost a cognitive restructuring. We really need to think differently about what we know and about things. Sorry if I'm taking too much time, but it's actually really that kind of reflection of what we know and how we know and how we are using that language, that knowledge, and in that reflection, and it's the power in it, and particularly in institutions like universities. These are institutions of power. They have so much power to decide or to support or to facilitate this process. So what is there and what is, because this is really shaping the people that are going through those institutions. So it's really reflecting that it's about representation. Like I said, there wasn't a lot of people like me going to college. Now there are probably more. In the schools, there are not teachers like me in the schools, or other kids in the primary schools, in the secondary schools, in the universities. And by representation, I don't mean tokenism. I mean just, just being, because you're there, because it's about your voice. It's about being given a voice to talk about bring these other forms of knowledge. And it's not about hierarchies. It's about equitable and about the distribution of that power. So being given a voice because they're there, and then they can talk about this energy. It's about these safe spaces I see in Ireland, creating this, because what I realized particularly, like the topic of even my curriculum is white or whatever it is, even thinking about the curriculum really came to the fore after the death of George Floyd. So in Ireland, it's very subtle. People are very silent about these things. It's almost like racism is not talked about. There's about a lot of gaslighting. So it's people being given that space to express themselves, and not just being, but really be not tokenism, but just being able to talk about it. So it's creating those space where the teachers or the students or the education people in charge of the curriculum can really have a conversation. It's about looking at how these marginalized forms of knowing, how do we bring them back at an equal footing? How do we discuss that? And how do we, as comparative knowledge, how do we even theorize that? So like in psychology, we have the transcultural psychology has made a lot of strands in that, of showing how these forms of knowledge are formed. Because we talk about first-class research, first-class university. And lo and behold, the first-class research and universities are in the West. They're in the global North. So it doesn't mean that the knowledge that is being produced in the South is not first-class. It's just that because the symmetric disparities, they probably won't have as much facilities or whatever it will be as the West. But it's actually really looking at that and looking at how do we support that knowledge. And I'm not even talking about not being rigorous as we do in academics. We are talking about peer reviewed. I'm talking about that, but finding a way to do that. So it's having those open spaces to really talk about that if we want to decolonize the curriculum in the Irish context. And it's about just seeing how we can bring that into be, and bringing people that are different into those discussions, because we are so, the Irish themselves, when they got, they're trying to decolonize the curriculum, it's about their own voices. It's about them telling their stories as opposed to the British telling their stories. So if we are really serious about this, we need us to come and tell our stories. We don't need people in the global North to tell their own stories and then tell the stories of the people in the global South. So it's to me, that's actually what I see. I really see not inclusion, because inclusion and diversity sometimes means you are adding on to something, which is good. But even though you're adding on to something and joining a club, there needs to be reflection on that which you are adding, not just adding, because adding without reflecting doesn't mean anything. So I think we need to have those very serious discussions, very uncomfortable discussions. But I think the teachers and the students and the institutions need to come together and have those spaces and have a conversation.
Thank you very much, Naomi. That you've raised so many important points here. I always think, and I know this is something I've discussed a lot with Hussein, is that decolonization of the curriculum is not just about adding in extra stories.
No.
It's about rethinking what we teach, how we teach it, and who gets to teach it. And especially when we talk about history, who gets to speak for Irish history and who gets to speak for history more generally. And one of the things that you've mentioned there, which I think is really important, is that it's not about pitting different types of history against each other, but it's about comparing fairly. So not seeing the Western forms of production of knowledge as the norm, not seeing the Irish experience of colonialism as the norm, not seeing African-American experiences of racism as the only form of racism, which in a way can work to hide racism here in Ireland. So I think, there are lots of ways that we can think about the structures within our education system, who gets to make policy on these, but also how we contribute to that, because as is often the case, and I know this is the case from talking to colleagues of colour here in Ireland and elsewhere, is that they're left doing this work, and it's generally not work that is recognised or rewarded, and it's often work that is done by people on precarious contracts. So those of us who are in positions of privilege need to get the balance right between using our position to push forward these agendas, but also not speaking for other people, giving people the opportunity to speak. And I think this might be a good chance for us to talk about maybe some of the stuff that has been happening in the UK around these issues. So maybe Hannah Rose, you might have something to say about the way these debates have played out in a British context.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about Naomi. That was a really beautiful speech, and I think that some of the problems around decolonizing the curriculum in the UK tend to be sort of like using it as a buzzword or a tick box. I've included a couple of books or workshops, or something like that within the curriculum. Okay, I've done my part now. And, as Naomi beautifully said, it has to be more meaningful, more consistent than that. It can't just be the odd book or concept or anything like that. It means seriously engaging with anti-racism, anti-colonialist work, reading and educating ourselves as teachers as well as our students. And we have to make sure the focus is on empowerment and representation, making those connections between the past and the present, not just sort of focusing on the past, as it were, thinking about those legacies. And again, as Naomi said, sort of shifting those power balances and thinking about new ways of knowledge production and dissemination. And also engaging with debates about how certain histories have been deliberately erased or invisibilized, within the archive as well, and bringing in those conversations. And I think it definitely, particularly in the UK, we have you mentioned sort of African American history there. I think we have a tendency to sort of focus on, for example, police brutality in the US, and I think we saw that obviously with the protests last year, but a lot of Black Lives Matter activists in the UK were obviously pointing to the UK's own history of police brutality. So that's really important when we think about those connections between past and present, and actually thinking about the legacies of empire and colonialism. And lastly, I'll just say, I think whether we are in a sort of school, or particularly for those of us who are in a university setting, we have to sort of relate this knowledge that we're using in this new curriculum to actually how our institutions perpetuate racism and racist practices. Part of this decolonizing the curriculum has to include hiring more people of color, encouraging more students of color, to universities, and to being part of this conversation and actually being engaged with them to create this new curriculum as well.
Thank you very much, Hannah Rose. We're getting some really fantastic comments in and questions from people. And I see somebody has raised the issue of traveller heritage and history in Ireland. And I know there has been extensive efforts made by traveller activists, including the Senator Eileen Flynn, to promote the teaching of traveller history and heritage in Ireland. So that's another aspect of this rethinking of our curriculum away from a very normative value that has generally been based in the history of kind of white, Catholic, male-dominated history towards a history that better reflects who we are as a society. I think another issue that has been raised that I think is really important is, we tend to talk a lot about universities. University academics are very obsessed with the university as a space in society. But of course, schools have a much broader reach into society. And then there are many people who consume history, who are interested in these questions, who don't have the access to the kind of privileged spaces that we have. So how can we go about democratizing the way we talk about the past and bringing these broader stories, the histories of people like Frederick Douglass, of African people who have been in Ireland for centuries, because there have been African people here for centuries. How do we bring in traveller history to broader audiences? Does any member of the panel really have anything to say about that broadening out of history to much bigger public audiences? Caroline, do you have anything to say on that?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Naomi and Hannah, both very passionate and really well put words. And I absolutely agree with you. I don't specifically, like, I kind of want to talk a little bit maybe about like what's happening, because one of the ideas behind Douglass Week is, Naomi, we're talking about creating these spaces to have these conversations, to have uncomfortable conversations. I know that a lot of people who have talked to me and my team and over the last couple of months, we have said, this is a space, Douglass Week is a space, and hopefully will be a space for the next coming years and decades, to have these conversations, to prompt conversation, to hear the voices, to, create these spaces where, like Naomi said, these safe spaces where we can talk about this. And I saw in the comments that I think Tracy was asking, what can we do? How can we facilitate these conversations? How can we talk about this? And I guess, now is a good time to talk about it too, because we're all, most of all here in the panel are involved in, developing this Frederick Douglass Ireland curriculum, and because my background is film and literature. And, if we just continue to offer sort of a white male or dominantly white male kind of reading list, then we just, what do we teach our students? And that's something that I've been trying to do in my own seminars and workshops and classes. If we teach our students the wrong lessons, I believe, because, who is an intellectual authority and who deserves our attention. So we don't want to continue that. And so what we've been doing, what we started a couple of months ago and what we're still doing together with the Cork Migrant Centre, with the Fred Douglass Family Initiatives, with Nano Place and so many other amazing partners, trying to focus on this part of Frederick Douglass, him coming to Ireland, and through that tell new stories, retell the history of or add to, and something that I thought was really important, what Naomi said earlier, telling or adding onto something, but reflecting and engaging with the community, hearing the voices, and not just, adding an extra part of a curriculum. So just to take one step back, there is what we've been doing is we've been looking at a very beautiful and wonderful, very inspiring curriculum that the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives has created. And I can share my screen in a minute to show that. And we've kind of looked at that, and we want to really focus on sort of, the Irish context in that, like we want to sort of, we've heard a lot about this in the last few days, the change in demographics in Ireland, and we want the curriculum, this part about Ireland, Douglass's time in Ireland, we want that to reflect the diverse society that we live in. And all of us who are teachers know that designing modules, designing workshops and courses, all of that means, narrating stories. And we need to reflect, and we need to critically engage, and we need to hear the voices. And like Naomi and Hannah Rose both said, I think that creating spaces for this kind of different kind of curriculum, engaging, we've created so much stuff during Douglass Week. We have videos, we'll hear so much more today even, there's music, there's art projects, there's dance, there's performance, there's so much that we can do to include in this curriculum. So I guess we want to celebrate Douglas with this curriculum, but we also want to, you know, bring this closer and really focus on what's happening in Ireland. And through that, like Naomi and Hannah Rose both said, you know, through that, sort of use it as a lens, and then, you know, look at where we are, you know, contextualizing on the one hand Douglas, but then also bring Douglas and his narrative and the topics that come up when you talk about Douglas, bring that closer to an Irish audience and make it more specific to, you know, what's happening in Ireland. So, you know, I'm gonna shut up now, but that was kind of my idea, because I think it's really important to work with is hearing voices, but not just hear them, but include them. And this is something that we're all working on together and have been for almost half a year now, that we're hoping to continue. And we can, you know, I know we will probably talk about this a little bit more later, but I think it's really important to know that, you know, we're working on this and that we're inviting people right now. Basically, we've gotten a lot of messages in the last few days, but we really want to invite educators out there who may be listening today to work with us and work with this group, work with, you know, all the people in Nano Legal Place and Cork Migrant Centre. We have beautiful and wonderful participants from the US as well, who have taught the Frederick Douglass curriculum there. And we want to really make it a unique and a different kind of curriculum.
Thank you very much for that, Caroline. We've had so many interesting comments and questions, and one of the suggestions that I came in here from Sarah, which I think is really important, is she says we talk a good talk about all these things, and one of the things that we talk a lot about is, you know, creating spaces for other forms of knowledge and empowering people to speak, etc. But what we should also be doing is really engaging with these other forms of knowledge ourselves and taking the time to read them. And I think that's a really important point. So, you know, when we say, oh, we will empower other forms of systemic knowledge or other forms of practice within the curriculum, that's not just about creating a space in which people of migrant origin can come in and teach those topics or can do those research topics themselves. It's also about thinking the way that we conduct ourselves, we conduct our teaching, we conduct our research based on European models of knowledge, models of pedagogy, models of research, and thinking, you know, that's not the only option there, and I must look at these other options ourselves. So that's something that quite a few people in the audience have been raising. I wanted to come back to the question of primary schools and teaching that's taking place there in primary and secondary schools. I know we have a number of teachers in the audience, and I know that some work that you, in particular, Naomi, have been doing about working materials and those questions. And we have a few questions here about how can we begin the process of kind of unlearning racism and unlearning you know, Eurocentric ideas about the world at primary school. What kinds of materials can we use, and what kind of teaching methods can we use? So Naomi, I know this is something that you've been interested in and working on with the Cork Migrant Centre, so it would be great if you could maybe speak to that, and if you wanted to share some of the materials you've used, or I can share them, we'd be happy to do that.
Okay, one of the things, before I even come to that, I had, there was someone who said about having the good talk of talking about of having other forms of knowledge, and we are not doing anything about it. One of the things I'd want to say as a Black person is that there's often so much burden on us to educate the world. It's such a burden on us to tell you about racism, a burden on us to tell you about other forms of knowledge. And like I would say, take it upon yourself. Part of that reflective process is taking it about among yourself to educate yourself. I did my PhD and came across so much intercultural research that was there. It was there. It's in published journals. They're there. So like educate yourself. They're simple as introducing a module in your courses that people can then go and research and talk about it. So my challenge to you there is go take it upon yourself to look at that other alternative language, to look at that comparative study that you have. And then the second thing I need to say is that the teachers themselves or the lecturers have a lot of power around the curriculum to accommodate this kind of work. Say a class, for example, of primary school teachers or secondary school teachers, you have projects that you give your students. Let them choose their projects. Let them maybe they want to say people who have made a huge contribution in science from Africa or from Arabic world or from China or whatever. So let that be a class project that can be brought into class and then that you can discuss. And then so you have leeway as teachers. You can do that. You can work around your projects and around your curriculum. Then the other thing I was going to say is the diversity and inclusivity of what you're saying is not just about adding a textbook into your work. It's more about being more reflective. And we are very good at critiquing. We teach students to critique in college. We need to teach them to also challenge. So critique and challenge the knowledge that we have and the knowledge base of that, the knowledge base of the production and what is passed and what is used for. So that as being part of it. So in terms of now the other materials we are talking about is, like I said, when we were talking about Frederick Douglass, I actually realized that in Ireland, the migrants that are here are not like the slave trade or the Africans that are in the UK that came from the plantations. These are people who have come from African countries. And whatever it is, that history is not taught. So we were doing a lot of work on racial awareness in schools because I think it starts with an awareness, with that reflective, by knowing that it's not just adding more syllabus that is more diverse, but it's about even looking at what you already have and what you're teaching. For example, in the syllabus that you have, what are the stereotypes, a generalization that are oppressive to your students? How does that impact on the student that is in your class? So that's a reflective process, so that every time you look at your curriculum today as you go to class, you look at what's there and you look at what is what is that reinforcing? So it's a process of actually reflecting, ongoing reflecting of what you have, and then include, because we said if we are looking at racial awareness and being reflective plus practice, we actually have to have a basis. And the basis of racial inequalities really does not have a better beginning than slave trade. So looking at Frederick Douglass gives us this precursor to the work that we can do in the schools. So, and with that we say looking at Frederick Douglass, and I come from a tradition that loves stories. Everybody loves stories. You tell a story with a beginning and end and people get engaged. So we found all the work that we are doing with the schools is through universal language of art and music. Because that's something, it's universal language and kids can understand. So we looked at the Frederick Douglass story as a precursor to the work we are doing in the schools. And we started demonstrating the story in art form. If you have it, team, you can share it.
I think I have it, so I think I can share it myself. This works. So here we can see some examples of the pages from the.
So if you go to the first, yeah. So like if you look at that now, we've kind of illustrated it very easily in a way that kids can understand. Like that's Frederick Douglass. He didn't even know when he was born. So his mother gave him a kind of a date in Valentine and became a Valentine. So that's something that kids can understand, like not knowing when you're born. And as it progresses, if you just flip through it, we just kind of tell his story. He didn't know how to read and he's learning how to read and all. And often we talk about, I hear a lot about decolonizing the curriculum and about dead white men and people critiquing people like Shakespeare and whatever. And to me, honestly, it's not even a binary issue. It's not even a white and black. It's about the concept. So they teach us something really good about humanity and about jealousies and about whatever it is. So that's the story of Douglass that brings up all those, his resilience. He's teaching himself how to read even when he couldn't, even when he was a slave. And what does that teach us, our kids, whether they're black or white? So it's telling that story and putting it in historical context, and then just kind of framing the present within that context.
Thank you very much, Naomi. That was really useful. Another thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I know other panelists have mentioned it before, is that a really useful way to help complexity, understand the complexity of these histories would be to teach Irish history and Irish experiences of colonialism in parallel to those of African countries. So people here understand what the parallels are and what the differences are and how race shaped those differences. So we get a basis for proper solidarity without false equation. But I want to come now to Kirsten and to Caroline, so you can just talk a bit about this excellent curriculum that was developed by the Frederick Douglass family and the abolitionists in particular. So Kirsten, would you like to go ahead?
Think I can now. Thanks. Thanks everybody, and thanks for this really inspiring conversation. It's great to hear from educators and people working in communities where this type of curriculum and outreach really makes a difference. Caroline, I don't know if you wanted to start talking about the curriculum and I can talk about our book project, or which way would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I
saw the screen there. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I was just sharing there this is basically the curriculum that I was talking about earlier. I'll share it again in a minute. Yeah, I guess part of what we're doing, like I mentioned this earlier, but we're trying to create this curriculum in Ireland, and I'll show you. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen again. It's just important to mention first that Hannah Rose, Naomi, Kristen, and a couple of other people are working on this together, and we're going to regroup after Douglass Week because there's so much material coming in. Where we are right now is basically phase 1 of the curriculum that we're developing, and we're sort of trying to finalize right now sort of a 1-hour educational lesson plan, basically, that we will share with a couple of pilot schools that some of our partners and colleagues have brought to us, or who have gotten involved, or who have contacted us. And in this 1-hour lesson plan, we basically, like I said earlier, we want to focus especially on this unique context of Ireland, and we have a couple of different aspects of that lesson plan, which we'll then use as a basis to develop in phase 2, where we will expand and extend this curriculum or this lesson plan. And I guess, Kristen, this is kind of where you come in, because part of what we're going to do is use or try and explore Frederick Douglass's narrative as a starting point, kind of what we're doing with Douglass Week, right? We're using this, the story and all of his experience, to using is maybe a wrong word, but like we're trying to start and expand and talk about all the important topics that come up. So Kristen, maybe you can talk a little bit about the narrative and how that plays into all of this, and I'll share my screen to show the curriculum.
Yeah, so we at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives have a project called 1 Million Abolitionists. In 2018, to celebrate the bicentennial of Douglass's birth, we published what Caroline is showing on the screen, which is a special hardcover edition of the narrative. Again, we published it. That picture on the front is really beautiful. It's actually, it looks like a picture or a photograph, but it's actually a pencil drawing done of Frederick Douglass by his grandson, Joseph. So that's an extraordinary part of it as well. But we published this bicentennial edition. It's hard to find a hardcover version of the narrative on Amazon or anywhere else. You can find Penguin editions and softcover editions everywhere. So we wanted to do something substantial to celebrate the bicentennial, and our 1 Million Abolitionist project, as the name would suggest, aims to get 1 million copies of this special hardcover bicentennial edition into the hands of students. We're working on it. We are at about 100,000 and counting, so we've got a little way to go, but we will get there through the efforts of these types of projects and others, working with other partners. But we found when we've distributed these books to students in the US, particularly in disadvantaged communities, For many students, it's the first hardcover book that they have. For many students, it's the first book that they have as their own. And just the experience of having something tangible with these powerful words in it for individual students is an inspirational experience. So we want to bring that experience to as many students as we can, and through the curriculum, inspire them to be activists in their schools and in their communities. And through the work of the Douglas Week team, some of the people here on the screen, some of the people behind the scenes, and many, many others, we're working with educators in the US as well, as Caroline mentioned, I think at the top, to share their experiences of teaching the curriculum here in the US. We're really excited about this expansion of the project to Ireland, and I should also mention to Northern Ireland as well. Got a number of interested in working with us there. So we're excited about this aspect of the continuation of Douglas Week and a lot of the kind of collaborations we've made here and will continue to make.
Thanks very much, Kristen.
Thanks.
As ever, we are incredibly short on time and inundated with just really fantastic comments and questions from our audience. And I find it really encouraging, because I think that there's plenty of scope in the future for us to hold much longer, bigger events around these topics. So I look forward to that. But for the moment now, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ray Casserly, who is a representative of the Council of International Education Exchange. Ray holds a doctorate in ethnomusicology from Queen's in Belfast, and he has taught in Queen's but also done lots of work border initiatives with music groups. His academic interests include music and conflict, communal memory and identity in the UK and Ireland. But Ray is the academic director for CIIE's Global Institute, and he oversees several hundred courses offered and delivered in 6 global institutes in Berlin, Cape Town, London, Madrid, Paris and Rome. And Ray is just going to talk to us about the Frederick Douglass Global Fellowship Scheme, which is a great opportunity to do the kind of work we've been talking about here today. So go ahead, Ray.
Cheers, Dónal. Thanks a million. And thank you to all my fellow panelists as well, and for the organisers of Douglass Week. It's an incredible honour for me to be joining this fantastic and esteemed panel and being a part of this week as we learn more about Douglass significance in Ireland and how we as a society can do more to understand our fellow citizens and those from around the world as well. It'd be remiss of me if I didn't also start by just showing gratitude to a dear colleague, Stacey Benjamin, who wasn't able to join us for this session today, but thank you for having me here. CIEE is the Council on International Educational Exchange, and we're a not-for-profit US. And not to give us an extended history of it, but long story short, we were really founded as a peace-building organization in the wake of World War II, using international exchange and education as a way of creating more understanding and solidarity between our various groups around the world. And we have a unique and very special program that we have named the Frederick Douglass Global Fellowship. And this year we're a contemporary manifestation of Frederick Douglass' legacy and impact in terms of how we on the island of Ireland understand the term agitate, agitate, agitate. And of course, afterwards, the following year, our group went to Cape Town, both times taught by one of our most esteemed faculty, Quentin Redcliffe. Quite fascinating to hear from Naomi earlier on today, speaking about University of Cape Town. It's fantastic campus. And in this context, of course, our students got to learn so much about the uniqueness of South Africa and how in many cases there are important distinctions from their experience as African Americans and minority students in the US and what they're seeing and experiencing in South Africa. And then, of course, in 2019, our students again came to the UK, centered in London, and again taking a co-curricular study tour to Belfast. Last year, we were hoping to bring our cohort to Cape Town, but of course, this feature called COVID-19 got in the way, so we had to delay that. But we're certainly delighted to return and come back with an even more bigger opportunity for our students to engage and learn in Ireland. We're also quite fortunate to have Nettie Washington Douglas as part of our programming as well, and she's been a keen supporter, and we're always very lucky to have her on board as well. And of course, the context of having our program housed entirely in Ireland this year in many ways does resonate with what we're seeing take place on the island of Ireland, and obviously in the context of the US and the George Floyd killing as well. So in Douglas' own words, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, we can see here where he identified how he was considered to be more welcome and acceptable and considered as a fellow human during his time in Ireland as well. And his words, "I can truly say I've spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life." And in his own narrative and his letters subsequently, of course, he refers to how people looked him in the eye and treated him as a fellow human. Now, of course, the Irish context is quite unique as well in terms of its relationship with the US and with the African diaspora in the US as well. And historically, dare I say, traditionally, we've often had a narrative of distinction wherein we associate the Irish diaspora in America with a very particular ethnic group. And of course, once the President Obama came to the fore, when he visited Ireland, when he famously put the apostrophe back in his surname in Dublin city centre, that of course, for many opened up a new scope towards understanding how we can look at our diaspora around the world, how we can engage with diaspora. And of course, in this program, it's going that significant step further. It's not just people in Ireland speaking at people from all over the world as they're situated in those contexts, but developing a more reciprocal program where students from minority backgrounds in the US are not just coming to hear white power privileged voices in Ireland, but to speak to them as well. And we referenced earlier on the term safe spaces. And in this context, we're also moving significantly towards the idea of a brave space, not just a brave space for our students, but a brave space for those who are hosting in Ireland, that we can have the courage to listen to these difficult stories, to educate ourselves more, as Naomi had rightly said as well, and for us to take on more agency, but accountability for what we know and what we do not know. We cannot assume by looking at our own histories that is enough. We can't also run the risk of conflating many of the horrors in our own history with horrors that we see in histories of others from around the world as well. So we're very, very hopeful that this program is going to be a significant step towards that rebalancing of a dynamic where we tend to prioritize and almost put in a competitive position our history above that of others. Now, for the Frederick Douglass Global Fellows, of course, there are some important need to know is 100% of the recipients' program fees are covered. It is going to be a 4-credit course that they'll be studying for 4 weeks this coming summer. And of course, we're very hopeful that the weather will be a little bit better for them. For many of the students that were hoping or planning to study in Cape Town last year, we've been advising them that a winter in Cape Town is equivalent to a summer in Dublin, so you probably don't need to change your baggage all that much. But I did want to emphasize how our application deadline is, of course, this coming Sunday, in commemoration, obviously matching the selected birthday of the great Frederick Douglass. So that's it in a summary of what we're trying to achieve here. We're hoping that people in Ireland, people from Ireland, can learn the lessons of Frederick Douglass, and of course from our students that are going to be joining us in Ireland, and we'll of course create future leaders from this program as well.
Thank you very much, Ray. That was really fantastic, and I encourage everybody to check that out. So organisers have given me the thumbs up because we've got so many questions. We can extend ourselves out a little bit, if okay. And I also want to point out something that Caroline has brought to my attention. I know we've an awful lot of school teachers on here, so we would love to hear from you. You contact us via our email address, which is up on our website. If you want to get involved with these programs about developing curricula around these questions, we'd be really happy to work with you. That would be great if you could get in contact with us. So I'm going to try and get through a few of these different questions. So I ask our panelists to do what us academics hate, just try and keep our answers short and to the point. But one of the questions that has come in, and I think Hannah Rose, you're perfectly positioned to answer this because of where you were based. But somebody has mentioned, Scotland is having this debate at the moment about its relation to the slave trade. And I wonder if you wanted to say something about that, and then we might talk a little bit about how Ireland's own history of involvement with empire and slave trade as both colony and participant in colonial expansion overseas shapes our attitudes to these questions.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think what's really interesting about Britain and particularly Scotland is that obviously a lot of debates have been going on for decades, but obviously have, there's sort of a light has been sort of shone on them, particularly after the events of last year. And I think that in a way, thinking and sort of linking it back to Frederick Douglass and the curriculum in Britain as well, there's sort of pockets in Britain where there's activists and teachers and students and some academics who are obviously trying to work together to create these amazing teaching resources that not only highlight Frederick Douglass, but also are obviously highlighting these legacies of slavery and colonialism. And through that, then obviously that's a way of talking about the lives and contributions of other people of colour who, as you mentioned as well, have obviously been around for centuries in Ireland and England and Scotland and Wales. And I think I just sort of wanted to say very quickly that sometimes some of that burden often, falls on activists and teachers. And just to give a very personal anecdote, my wife is a teacher and she's worked in 3 schools in 3 different counties across England. And if it wasn't for her working with some local activists as well, but really pushing for these stories to be told on the curriculum, both within and outside Black History Month, then these stories wouldn't be told. So obviously, while there's been some really great work, like particularly in Scotland that's going on right now, there's obviously just these pockets of the rest of Britain that aren't having the experience of being able to, these stories just aren't being told. And I think as well, the importance of bringing it to the present day in light of obviously the protests last year, but also the decades of local activists in Bristol and Edinburgh and Glasgow that have been really challenging obviously these colonialist legacies. And I will just end very quickly on one of my favourite quotes from Frederick Douglass when he was speaking in Britain and Ireland, was that he would say there could be no real peace where there wasn't justice. And I think obviously that speaks to this, what we're talking about on this panel, but then also just the kind of connections and thinking about legacies.
Thanks very much, Hannah Rose. We've had numerous questions in about this kind of specificity or complexity of Ireland's own history as a location both of colonisation and as a country in which members of our society from across the strata, across religious and class backgrounds, participated in different ways in empire abroad. And this is a discussion that's really getting started. It's a discussion that has been present in the historiography, in academic writing in Ireland for quite a while, but there's one that is kind of boiling over a bit more into contemporary discussions now, particularly as we have this kind of complicated attempt to build a solidarity that recognises some shared experiences, but also acknowledges the very important limits on that shared experiences and the way that Irish people abroad perpetuated and reinforced white supremacy. So that's something that we need to think about. And when we're talking about teaching these histories, I'm a historian, so I'm particularly fixated on history, but when we're talking about teaching these histories, it's not about teaching Frederick Douglass an American history of slavery or colonialism in Africa. It's also about teaching this as part of Irish history, that Ireland's experience of empire was shaped by and shaped imperial experiences overseas. And I think that's a really crucial way for us to proceed with this effort to kind of decolonize our pedagogy and our methodology. So we've had several different questions about, and I think this is something that we should address, and I might come to you, Naomi, on this. Something that has been raised by quite a few people is, can we actually even decolonize the institutions we're talking about, schools, universities? These are institutions that are, were constituted, built the end of the 19th century quite often, at a time in which imperialism, in particular in Africa and Asia, was expanding. They are by their nature colonial institutions, by their origins. what extent can we really decolonize them, and what does the the limits placed on institutions of education by the neoliberal economic order, for example, mean for this project? So I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Naomi.
I can say, it's a difficult one, because that's the crunch of it. Because as people, in academia or teachers or whatever, you may have the best will in the world, but unless the institution that is there is supporting you, it's really difficult. And it's so complex. It has to do with funding. It has to do with so many other things. I'm not saying it's an impossible task, but I think it's just to adjust our expectations and know that it's a really difficult journey. But I would say every journey begins with a single step, because I think we've seen, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of the idea of social justice coming to the fore and people getting more engaged. But I think my worry is that some of it is becoming tokenism. What can we do to be seen to be doing something? Whereas at the heart of it is, we cannot talk about social justice without talking about epistemological justice, because it is an injustice to marginalizing those forms of education, of knowledge. So all I can say, my answer to that, it's an uphill journey. It's difficult because it's really complicated, but we have to try, and we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, we have to try means we all have to try. So particularly, and this is to speak to something both Naomi and Hannah Rose have raised, people on precarious contracts do a lot of this work. And that is very true of Douglas Week, where the key organisers are people who are on precarious contracts. People within the universities often doing this kind of work are often people in precarious contracts. And of course, we know people of colour are disproportionately on precarious contracts within academia and the workplace in Ireland. So that's something that those of us who enjoy the privilege of not being on precarious contracts should really, really engage with. And we should also encourage institutions, universities, and other institutions that are very happy to lend their name to important initiatives like Douglas Week, to then follow that up by supporting members of staff and people of colour in those jobs. So one of the really encouraging things that come true in the comments are all these teachers saying that already they've been using the material that has come up in Douglas Week. They've been tuning into things, they've been teaching that to their class, and they've been using that to explain the difference between performing, as you've said, performing kind of tokenistic solidarity and being real allies. So I wonder if either Caroline or Kristen want to say something about how you see, how you plan to build on Douglas Week going forward around questions of the curriculum.
Where to start?
Yeah.
Where to start? I think that Naomi, especially with you guys in the Cork Migrant Centre, but with so many other partners, so many collaborations have started before and now during Douglas Week. And Dónal, I can't honestly, I don't know where to begin my answer to this question, because there's so many great initiatives coming out of this. And Kristen always jokes, she says it's Douglas year, it will be Douglas decade. But you'll see the next panel, actually, in the next couple of panels, the Cork Migrant Centre group and so many other, educators, academics, researchers, activists, artists, performers, musicians, filmmakers. There's so many people involved in this, and this is just the beginning. So I'm really looking forward to continuing all this work with everyone. And also really important to point out, join us, join this. This is something it's been a very collaborative effort, and it's a space, like Naomi was saying, sort of bringing it back to the beginning. Naomi was saying, we need to create these spaces, and I hope that, we all hope that Douglas Week is a space that will continue to be there for creative commemorations and for continuing this educational effort through creativity, through art, through performance, and through new methods of education. So we'll see. We'll all go on the journey together. That's my answer.
And I'll just add quickly that it warms my heart to hear that Douglas Week materials and conversations have inspired teachings already in schools, and that's the goal. So thank you to those who have started to do that, and thank you to those who will continue that work. And as Caroline said, we're really excited to continue Douglas Week activities well beyond 2021.
Thank you very much. So I think we should bring this to a close, just because I know our organisers have yet another 100 panels and activities to go ahead with, and they're just so incredibly busy. But I wanted to just finish by thanking all of our panelists. We've managed to cram an awful lot into a very short period, and I know we could have this conversation for another 3 or 4 hours, and the questions will continue to come in. So that has been really, really encouraging and fantastic. I think it's important, that we close by remembering two quotes I always associate with these processes. The famous quote from Frantz Fanon, someone who's a philosopher very close to my own heart, who's from Martinique, but I worked in Algeria, the country I studied. And he said decolonization is a process of complete disorder, which means that we need to cast off the structures that we have traditionally been used to, and be ready to do the hard work, and be ready to be called out in our mistakes as we do this process. And the other one is that decolonization is not a metaphor. So it's not just about taking down a statue or changing a flag, or indeed it's not just about occasionally appointing a person of color. It's about changing structures, and it's about changing attitudes. And in that process, we need to be sensitive, we need to be make ourselves vulnerable, and we need to kind of craft a new ethics of teaching. And I think we've begun that conversation here today. And I know Douglas Week has been motivated by that very spirit throughout. So it's been really great to see. I encourage everybody to continue to tune into all the fantastic events that lie ahead. I look forward to continuing these conversations with all of our panelists, and I wish you all the best for the rest of Douglas Week. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And we'll see you the next